person in the audience or two people?
I'm gonna run and grab coffee. Does anybody want one? Good,
Thanks.
okay, yeah, you're welcome. Well, they catch it down here, Rebecca, I'm sorry.
You're good.
So it seems like we have 2 minutes till we're officially getting started then, I
Yeah.
believe, 9:15
You
is...
can go ahead.
Yeah.
I can
you're
just
good.
begin? Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, in that case, thank you for joining. The topic obviously today, religions and cultural norms in Asia, and this is based on the travels that I've done in the past year. I went to India for a week last November over Thanksgiving break, a really whirlwind trip. It's a lot of a country to see in a week, but it was a nice little highlight. I went to Japan and Malaysia and Brunei this summer, and so presentation is based on my experiences. I do like to preface that because I feel like I make a lot of generalizations in trying to cover pretty big topics and a lot of very varied religions that are much more nuanced than I really have the time to cover in 30 to 40 minutes, but so it is based on my experience, and I hope that you take it with a little bit of a grain of salt as you ask questions. I'll do my best, but I don't want to try and misrepresent a religion or a culture just based on the brief experience that I had.
What took you there?
India was just for fun because I had always wanted to go, and there was a sale on flights, and I had Thanksgiving break, and I thought, why not? As a single female traveler, that was a pretty big culture shock, and I've been to about 50 countries now, but that was probably the most difficult. I mean, I never felt unsafe. There were definitely times I felt uncomfortable just because it is such a different culture, but it was just for fun. Japan, I went with my family, and then they came back because they had to work, but being a teacher and having the summers off, I figured I was already in Asia, I might as well stay and make it more worth the time to fly, so I spent an extra 2 weeks in Malaysia, and then Brunei was a little side trip. It's a very small country, but I figured while I was there, I might as well. So I'll work through these chronologically in order of when I was there, and then I'll have time for questions at the end, so I guess take mental notes as you have them. But I will begin with India. As an overview of the country, that has a population of 1.4, oh yes, go ahead.
Is there a test at the end?
There is no test at the end, unless you're testing me, I suppose, to make sure I keep my facts straight, but I guess being a teacher, it wouldn't be surprising if I passed out a fill in the blank or some sort of bubble sheet, but no. So India has a population of 1.4 billion. It is now the largest country in the world in terms of population. And for religion, the breakdown is 72.5% Hindu, 14.5% Muslim, 5% Christian, 2% Sikh. There are about 1 to 2% that are agnostic or other religions such as Judaism. But you can see if you do the math there that almost everyone in the country follows some sort of religion. And as a whole, from my experience, it did seem like it was fairly peaceful in terms of the coexistence of different religions. The picture on this slide is of the biggest mosque in Delhi, biggest mosque in the entire country, in fact. And you could go in and visit despite not being Muslim. You did have to cover up, wear something that covered your hair, as a woman at least. And 5 times a day people come in to pray. And the Muslims living in Delhi, despite living in a predominantly Hindu population, are free to practice their religion, are, according to law, not discriminated against in terms of jobs, despite some issues in the past, I suppose you could say, in terms of fighting in between the religions. Nowadays, overall, there is pretty much peace and coexistence between the different groups. Just to briefly cover some of the past tensions, because as you can see, again, very, very different numbers of Hindu versus Muslims, and it did used to be a lot more equal leading up to the partition. And that happened at the end of British colonialism. So when the British left and passed off rule to the locals, they decided that in order to try and deal with a lot of infighting between Muslims and Hindu, which at the time was split fairly evenly distributed throughout the country, they were going to create a section of India, name it Pakistan, and that was going to be where the Muslims lived, and then the India would be left for the Hindus. And so in August of 1947, there was an announcement on the radio that this was going to happen, and you had, I think, a week or 2 to cross the border, which led to the biggest displacement of people in history. Then also a pretty large amounts of violence. And in fact, violence was encouraged leading up to the partition. that local leaders were encouraged to harass or mistreat the minority religion in an effort to try and encourage them to leave the country. That we're in India, let's poke at the Muslims and hope that this causes them to leave. And of the 15 million people displaced, 1.2 million of the Muslims that left India never reached Pakistan, and 84,000 approximately Sikhs and Hindus leaving what was then became Pakistan never made it to India. So it was a very violent time. In the end, it did help somewhat with the conflict because there was a lot more unity in terms of religion within the two countries, but for a period of time, there was a lot of violence. And in fact, there still is a decent bit of conflict in the northwest towards the border here. In fact, just I think 2 weeks after I left India, there were missiles fired in the northwest region. So definitely still some conflict between Muslims and Hindus, but as a whole, it's definitely helped with a more peaceful coexistence. What was East Pakistan is now Bangladesh as of 1971, but the British did this intentionally in order to try and curb some of the fighting within the country and leaving Hindus, which is a very peaceful religion, to hopefully be able to practice and have a country that was a little bit more unified. So to go a little bit more into Hinduism, and this is the Akarshan temple, which is just outside of Delhi. When I was in India, it was one of the places that impressed me the most. I went to India expecting to be blown away by the Taj Mahal, and I was. It absolutely met or exceeded expectations. You know, sometimes you see pictures and then you're there and you're like, okay, like this is cool for a photo. But this was equally impressive, and I could not take pictures of my own. I had to take one off the internet, but it is one of the largest Hindu temples. And it felt like Disney World on steroids. Everything was so pristine, so beautiful. And it really felt like a sacred place that I was just in awe, despite having very little knowledge ahead of time of Hinduism. As a religion, it is a belief that everything is part of one supreme being. And while there are many, many deities that are worshipped, generally Hindus will pick one deity to worship that focuses on a specific element they feel is important to their life. They believe everything is God, and it's just different ways of worshiping. And so this temple, walking around, everything is hand-carved in marble and precious stones, and every single surface is ornately decorated. And so walking around and seeing that just was truly awe-inspiring. In Hinduism is also where we get the concept of karma and dharma, of doing what is right and following the correct path, and if there is some sort of conflict or you do not follow the correct path, then there will be some sort of consequence afterwards. They have the belief of rebirth, and that if you have good karma, this will lead to you being reborn in a better way and hopefully then reaching enlightenment at the end. So while Hinduism is predominantly practiced, I thought these two places that I visited were really good examples of how Hinduism nowadays does coexist fairly well, and for the most part in history has pretty peacefully coexisted with other cultures. On the left was a palace of a former emperor, former Raj of India, and he had 3 wives, as one does, I suppose. And one wife was Hindu, one wife was Muslim, and one wife was Jewish. And so he had 3 separate parts of the palace, one for each wife. I suppose helped a little bit with fighting. But the architecture and the design of everything really incorporated elements of the 3 different religions. I don't know how well you can see the gates right here, that it is stone where windows are sort of carved into it. So it helps to filter out the light, keep things cool, and this was true of all of the windows, that there was no glass, it was just stone with holes carved into it. But the shapes of the holes were the Star of David, and also the crosses and different geometric patterns that were associated with all 3 religions. And so it was a way of not only uniting the different religions and his marriages with 3 different women of these religions, but also just the architecture that celebrated the differences, but also the similarities of the 3. And then on the right is the oldest stepwell in all of India that is still surviving. It is believed to be around 1,400 years old, which I always think is wild when we think of the United States. And, oh, this is a really old building, it's 200 years old. And they're like, yeah, that's nothing. But this was built again as a palace and also a way of storing water. The royal family in the summer would live in this area, and as the water rose during monsoon season, then this would act as natural air conditioning. And it was Hindu when it was built, and so there were many statues and carvings. Over time, when it was eventually invaded, many of the statues were destroyed. And so there are only a few left, especially down below where the water line was when it was invaded. The water covered up some of the statues, and so those remain untouched. But they're doing archaeological findings now to try and uncover some of what is left of these statues that were thousands and thousands of years old. So although they did deface some of the statues, believing that then their gods would be able to triumph, I suppose, over the Hindu gods, because the statues were no longer there protecting it. As a whole, the site was preserved as recognition of still the really impressive architecture that took place there. And at last, I want to touch a little bit on the caste system, because that is a pretty important element of Hinduism, the idea of rebirth and having good karma, good dharma, being able to elevate your status in society. So the caste system is basically wherever you're born, that's where you're stuck. And although it is, again, technically illegal to discriminate based on the caste system, it goes from the untouchables that have the lowest level of society, the most menial jobs, up to the highest caste system, which would almost be like the royalty, the elites. And so your caste system depends on your occupation, who you're allowed to marry, your level of education. My driver, while I was there for the first couple of days, was in a lower caste. And so getting to talk to him was a really fascinating way to get insights into the culture that I probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise, because his English was very poor, he had a fairly low level of education. The tour guides that I interacted with would have been higher up and therefore had a very different point of view on life in India. And one of the things that he was really arguing for, which I found shocking, was arranged marriages. Because in keeping with the caste system, you marry someone within your caste, and your parents decide that for you, because family is an incredibly big part of Indian culture, and so they know their children and want to match them with someone that they believe will be compatible. He got married when he was 13 years old, and he and his wife had their first child when they were 14. And they've now been married for 23 years, and he said, the rates of divorce for those that are arranged marriages are much, much lower. We're much happier in the long run. People that marry for love, they end up fighting and falling out of love, and then they separate. So having this arranged marriage is really a valuable part of Indian culture, making sure that you stay connected in these relationships. So I don't think that's something that's going to really take off in the United States, but it was something that was really interesting to hear about, and his takes on religion and family life. On the right was just a cute group of girls that I met at one of the palaces that I was touring, and I was in line for the bathroom, and one girl came up and asked, can I have a picture with you? And I said, yeah, sure. And all of a sudden, this group of 20 girls all wanted their photo with me. So they were asking, do you wear a sari in the United States? And she was like, of course she doesn't. But they thought it was really interesting to meet an American. And I got a lot of requests for photos. When it was kids, it was very cute. When it was like random men, it was a little bit weirder. And my tour guide explained that they'd then go home and be like, this is my American friend, and I'm definitely gonna go visit her. And when I go to the United States someday, I'm like, yeah, our 2-sentence conversation became we're the best of friends. But it was a neat way of connecting with people. I guess having a white person in a sari is not the most common sight, depending on where you are in the country. And then in the center, part of Hinduism, and cows are considered sacred. And so you'd see them wandering the streets all the time, and often with garlands around their necks and different temples in the streets. They just leave food for the cows to eat. But eventually you stopped really noticing that they were there. It became less exciting. On the first couple of days, it was all these cows. I'm like, I need to take a picture. This is so cool. And at the end, it's like, oh yeah, there's another cow. Not a really big deal. But really a very fascinating trip. Definitely a place I'd like to go back someday, because 7 days is definitely not enough to truly get the full experience, but it was a nice little taste. And also, by the end of the week, I was pretty exhausted. It's a very loud, 1.4 billion people, not the cleanest, but still a really fascinating insight into a culture that is so different than anywhere else I've been. So next I'll jump to Japan, where I went last summer. And although it has a much smaller population, 124 million people compared to 1.4 billion, Tokyo, the capital, is actually the most populated city in the world. And so we did still get a little bit of that sensation of enormous crowds and being lost in it, although it was a little bit easier to navigate, a lot more technology, a lot more familiar to home. If you look at the breakdown of religions in Japan, we have 83 million believers in Shintoism, 86 million Buddhists, 2 million other religious practitioners, including Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Sikhism. But if you do the math there, you'll notice that there are more religious followers than there are actually people in Japan. And the reason for that is that many of the people in Japan practice Shintoism and Buddhism simultaneously. The religions are different. Shintoism focuses a lot more on the worship of nature, or kami, the spirits of nature, and it is more about finding rituals in your everyday life to have like cleanliness and recognizing the purity of the world around you, whereas Buddhism is about the afterlife and suffering leading you to enlightenment. So many Japanese people believe that Shintoism is for life and then Buddhism is for death, and so the two can coexist because they are all part of finding peace and enlightenment and how your everyday life leads to you growing as a person. So this was a statue of Buddha, as you can see, a very giant Buddha, one of the Buddhist temples, but there were a lot more Shinto temples that we visited, and Shintoism is really only found in Japan. So it was neat to get to learn about that firsthand. Here are a couple of more Shinto temples. The center is the gates that they're very common in temples. They're torii gates, and the idea is as you walk through them, you enter the spirit world. So walking through them is meant to be a meditative practice where you are focused more on nature and the sound around you. Oftentimes the temples will be filled with trees and rocks and just different elements of nature that you can find peace away from the surroundings of the busy cities. My sisters and I were talking as we were looking at the gates because they sold souvenirs, like little things that you can hang. We decided to get it as a Christmas ornament, but generally it was meant to be hung like as a way of showing fortune. And so you write on it in the kanji, in the Japanese lettering, your wishes. So you might write health or prosperity or family. And so I was doing my best to try and write the kanji as accurately as possible. And we're joking like, oh, what if you mess it up and it said something totally different? So we checked on Google Translate. Turns out it translated well. We're like, well, what if wonder what they had on this? We use Google Translate and it turns out it would be the names of businesses. And so we're thinking like these beautiful thousands of gates leading through the Fushimi Inari temple, and it's just whatever company in the date, because as they're doing restoration, companies are sponsoring. But it's still really a very beautiful, awe-inspiring place, although towards the end I will admit that we did start to be like, okay, it's another temple. We've been to a couple dozen so far. Maybe less impressive than it was for the first one or two. But as you can see, some of the rock elements. So this was a section that was for children and a way of recognizing the spirit of maybe new to become parents or parents that have lost children at a young age. And so finding peace in knowing that their spirits are now part of nature again. On the right was a cemetery, so similar stone, very natural design elements there. And lastly, more for the culture portion of things, is what I was impressed by with Japan is how clean and pristine and the social expectations that you had, almost to the point where it felt like everyone in Japan was afraid of sticking out, that you wanted to blend in with everyone else around you. Crime rates in Japan are incredibly low, and part of that is because you don't want the shame of being called out for being different. To the point that when we went on the subway in Tokyo, which I said was the biggest populated city in the world, and there are thousands and thousands of people in the subway, and every single person is wearing black pants and a white shirt with a black backpack. So my family and I wearing like blue and red and yellow, it was always easy to find someone because we stuck out and everyone else blended in. And part of that is the norms of politeness, of bowing when you meet people, of having just the expected way of interacting with others, to the point where if you went to Nara, which is an island with deer, they've even taught the deer to bow in respect to you, and the deer get food once they bow. You bow, you give them a cracker, they bow again, they chase you until you give them more crackers. But the fact that even the deer in Japan were that polite was very impressive, and I think that really ties in with that idea of the religion, both Shinto and Buddhism, focusing on that harmony with nature, harmony in the world around you, trying to find peace, and so that shows in every aspect of life in Japan. All right, moving along, because I still have a couple more countries to get through. Next we'll go to Brunei. And Brunei is an incredibly small country that borders Malaysia. It's basically one really big city makes up the entire country, and it is an Islamic state that practices Sharia law. And while it is a much less extreme practice and enforcement than you might get in the Middle East, you notice that my friend and I did not have to cover our hair. You would get in trouble if you were walking around in shorts and a tank top, but as long as you're dressing what they consider to be modest, you are okay. But for the people living in the country, it is illegal, for example, to try and convince someone not to go to mosque, because 98% or so of people in Brunei are Islamic or are Muslim, and so anything that would discourage practicing of that would be illegal. It's also illegal to criticize the Sultan and his family. You will go to jail for saying anything negative or publicly whipped, as either one of those or possibly both. And so it is an incredibly clean and pristine and beautiful country and city, but part of that does definitely seem to be out of fear of the laws that are in place. And so we are standing in front of one of the Sultan's 3 palaces, and you only could see very, very little because the Sultan is the 5th richest person in the entire world. This is because Brunei is on top of a lot of oil, and so the wealth of the country comes from that oil. And so as a whole, compared to other people in Asia, the population is pretty well off, lives pretty comfortably, has very good education, the public, different resources and like police and fire and other comforts that they have are again, better standards than perhaps surrounding areas. But it's definitely still a pretty big difference between the average person and then the Sultan. On the right is a picture from one of the mosques, and this was a mosque that he built. You can see the Tiffany glass dome, and if you go into the center of the mosque where you would actually go to pray, there is an enormous chandelier made of 24-karat gold with Sarawak crystal. The altar at the front is again all gold, and so it is a beautiful place to worship, but definitely also a way for the Sultan to be able to show off a little bit of his wealth and to show his faith through the contribution of this money. Yes?
Rebecca, can you tell me what that structure above the girl in the striped shirt might be? It looks like a bridge or a roller coaster.
It's not a roller coaster. It was
built inside a roller coaster.
Yeah, it does. I think it was lit up, and so at night it was just an archway in front of the entrance to the palace.
Cool.
But it does look very metallic compared to most of the rest of the palace, which is marble. So unfortunately, we were not allowed to get closer. Our tour guide joked that we were going to his house, but he had lost the keys. So unfortunately, we had to just stand by the front gate, and as the armed guards are standing there, making sure that we don't get too close to the gate for comfort. But it was a pretty impressive structure.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Just to give a little bit of juxtaposition with some of the wealth of the Sultan versus the average person, this is Kampung Air, which is a traditional floating village. It's called the Venice of the East because it actually was the biggest hub of trading in Asia for a very long time, comparable to Venice in Italy. And there are still 30,000 people living on these houses on stilts. They get around by boat. So they have a fireman boat, they have police boats, they have school boats that pick up children and drop them off to school. They also have floating ramps and walkways that get you from place to place as well if you don't have a boat that you can walk from the town hall to maybe some of the nearby houses. But this would be the much more average way of living. So not everyone lives in a floating house like this, but this would be more typical of the amenities that the average person in Brunei has, which is still very much a step ahead of some of the neighboring countries, but pretty sharp difference between how they live versus how the Sultan might live. Just going back to, again, the idea that he was untouchable sort of in terms of anything he does because it is, again, illegal to criticize him. One of the museums we went to, it was the Museum of Islam, and it was 5 stories just going through how it is the most logical and the best way of living, and it is all-inclusive way of having, and it is a very beautiful religion that has a lot in common with Christianity, but the fact that the very first floor was all about the Sultan and his wisdom, talking about in every aspect how even as a child he was wise and led his siblings who admired him so and always listened to every instruction he gave them, because that's the normal relationship between siblings. You know, your sibling says this, you're like, of course, older brother, you are so intelligent and obviously everything you say is correct, you just care for me and my best interest. did feel a little bit like propaganda, just a little. And then every museum you go to, oh, the Sultan visited our village and we were all blown away by his knowledge and we're appreciative of the insight he had for our people. But he does seem to be fairly well loved as a whole because of what he is able to build and offer in terms of education and public services. So very interesting as a tourist. I don't think that living there would be a lot of fun just because it is so like almost a police state. But as a tourist, it was very beautiful and a different way of living than I suppose the freedoms that we have in the United States. So it does make you appreciate a little bit some of the things that maybe we take for granted on a daily basis in terms of religious freedom and freedom of expression. And finally, I'll wrap up with Malaysia. You can actually see in this map of Malaysia, this is where Brunei is, that little inlet there. It all used to be one country. It was the Kingdom of Malay for many years. And then I believe in the 70s, it split, again, due to religious differences. Singapore was meant to be part of it, but they broke away because Singapore is predominantly Christian, whereas Malaysia and Brunei are Islamic. Brunei stayed its own country just for purely monetary reasons. That very small area that is on top of oil has a lot more wealth than the rest of Malaysia, so they wanted to be their own thing and be able to keep that wealth to themselves. But the breakdown of religion in Malaysia, there is Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism, but in order to be considered Malaysian, by definition, the one museum said the 3 requirements: you should be of Malaysian ethnicity, which could be Singaporean or Brunei or from either side of Malaysia. The vast majority of the population lives in Western Malaysia here. Borneo, this is the island of Borneo, and so the majority of this island is jungle, and this is where you find like the orangutans in the wild. So this island is much more Christian. The state of Sarawak that you see, that's like all of that red, and I'll get more about why that is later. But so 80-ish% of the population of Malaysia is Islam, and in fact that is one of the requirements. So you have to be ethnically Malaysian, you have to speak the language of Malay, and you have to be Muslim. If you are not Muslim, you are not Malaysian. And that goes down to practices that I saw, such as like birth and marriage traditions, to being circumcised as a child, and that is for both males and females. The one museum that I saw, I was a little bit shocked by that the girls are generally circumcised at just a few weeks old, and the males, they wait until they're 10 to do the circumcision, because then it's a formal ceremony. If you convert as an adult, you're also expected to be circumcised, so I would have a hard time imagining that many people are rushing to convert as adults, because that doesn't seem like a particularly pleasant thing. But it is, if you read studies and or the statistics where they go around and ask people, like, do you support this? And 90% of women would say, yes, I want this done for my daughter as well, because it's part of my Muslim and my Malaysian identity, that this is just all part of being Malaysian, part of being Muslim. However, you do get the smaller religious groups that are still part of society. Both of the pictures on this slide are at Buddhist temples, and it is not uncommon to see the different religions, like one temple, a Buddhist temple next to a mosque, or a Christian church down the road from a mosque. So it does very much coexist very peacefully. But when I went to Sarawak, to the eastern peninsula, or the eastern island of Malaysia, I got a little bit more of a background of what that looked like in terms of coexisting, because I stayed at a homestay of a Budaya tribe, and so I got to experience a little more firsthand what life was like in a more indigenous community. And part of that is staying in a longhouse by the water, traditional ways of cooking, but many of these communities have adopted Christianity. Still, what would be considered like pagan practices are still practiced to some extent, with traditional medicine and like finding spirits in nature. But our main guide, as we stayed in the village, was the local pastor. And so he talked a lot about his faith. And the reason why most of Sarawak is Christian is because during British colonialism, there was a lot of infighting in different territories. And a British general with the last name Brooks, he helped to end the fighting and come with a peaceful treaty that left everyone pretty happy, and in thanks, they gave him the province of Sarawak to rule. And so he became known as the White Raj, the white leader of this one region, and his family maintained control for the next 100, 200 years or so. And so he brought in and introduced Christianity, which was widely adopted. He established schools and was pretty beloved if you compare him to most colonial rulers in parts of Asia. He was really accepted into society there. But the pastor, when I asked about what do the different religions look like, he said, well, our religions coexist really nicely. That if there's a Buddhist celebration, everyone in the community, everyone will go celebrate. If there is a Muslim holiday, everyone will be there and will celebrate as one, same with Christianity. But if you aren't Muslim, you can't work for the government. And government jobs would include teaching, law enforcement. The government is probably responsible for at least half the jobs in the country. And so if you're not Muslim, your job opportunities are severely limited. And as a pastor, he said that he's been approached multiple times by leaders of Islamic mosques and asked to convert, and told that if he will convert, then they'll send him to Mecca, that they will pay him so much, and then for every person that he converts, it would be, I think, the equivalent of about $50, which would be an incredible amount of money for someone living in Sarawak. That he was telling us about a number of years ago when there was a couple that visited and they gave him $400, and that was enough for him to rebuild his entire house. So the amount of money that they'd be willing to give him for every person that he converts would be absolutely life-changing. And he said, if I convert, everyone in the community they'll follow me. But how could I deny my faith? How could I possibly turn my back on my Savior? And like that would be no life. I'd rather live humbly and live poorly, but have like this conviction in what I believe in. So I don't know, that just was really impressive to me, because I feel like in the United States, like we can feel really strongly about our religion, and our faith, but we don't maybe have it put to the test in that sort of way, where that would be a totally life-changing, the way of life would be so different, but he said he wouldn't even consider it. And so I found that really moving as well. But to get a little bit more into what life looks like in these Indigenous communities, in addition to the religion, as I mentioned, they still practice traditional cooking and medicine. Every time we walked somewhere, as we'd walk, someone would point out, oh, well, that tree, if you break it open, you can use the inside sap as glue. And this one, if you boil this leaf, it will cool your eyes if your eyes are burning. And this one, if you mix it with these other plants, then it's good for your stomach. And every plant I'd look at, like, those all look exactly the same to me. But to them, every individual plant has some sort of use, and they know what it can be used for. And so we got to practice that firsthand with cooking. This was their farmhouse. We had to walk about 20 minutes through jungle in order to get there. And on the way, we stopped and we picked ferns that we ended up getting to eat. They also used pumpkin leaves and pineapple and a root that they said is their version of ginger, and a different root that is their version of onion. And the way that you cook traditionally is with bamboo, because before metal is common, if you cut a piece of bamboo at the right place, there is a section that goes through and acts like a lid, or it closes the bottom, and then the inside of the bamboo is hollow. So you fill it with water, you dump in your rice, or you dump in your leaves, and then you cook it over a fire. And you can tell when the food is done when the outside of the bamboo is a dark brown. And so then you pour everything out, and then you can burn the rest of the bamboo as firewood, and so everything gets used. And it's incredibly sustainable. Bamboo grows so quickly. You can also see that they construct their house out of bamboo, although they were quick to point out as we walked that, well, that's the type of bamboo that we use for building, and this is the type of bamboo that we use for cooking, and this is the type of bamboo that we use for, I'm like, though, again, all of these bamboo look identical to me. I have no idea how you can tell the difference between them, but they are really in tune with the world around them. And so I like this quote by Jason Brooke, who is a descendant of the original Brooke that was the leader of Sarawak for so long, that when I think of what Sarawak could be most proud of, it must be that its people continue to see differences as a positive, not something to divide, but to enrich the whole community. That they can maintain their traditional practices and also adopt they can have running water and electricity, and they can take in some of the modern things that a Western society offers while still staying true to the way that they practice life for so long. And lastly, I'd like to finish with Malaysia. This museum, I think, was the most impressive in terms of some of the different the ways that they showed the different influence of culture from the West. And it was a museum that was not on my radar when I was planning the trip, but was a recommendation from one of the guides. We're like, we'll stop in, it's a rainy afternoon, why not? And it showed a lot of the traditional crafts, so pottery and weaving and carving, masks that had different spirits in order to try and ward off evil spirits, because they very much believe still in spirits, despite being Christian. I mean, the pastor was telling us, the one time that there was a group of tourists that got lost and they were following a spirit that looks like a friend but that would lead them to their death, and so I cut my hand and spilled blood and I prayed and then the spirits went away. And so it is an interesting combination of, again, the traditional practices with also Christianity at the same time. But one of the biggest influences that Western society brought was through trade, because as I mentioned, Kampung Ayer was the Venice of the East, and at the time, the Kingdom of Malaysia, this was all part of the same country. And so they were a hub for trading, and part of the reason for that was because of Islam. Because when the leader of the Kingdom of Malay converted in, I believe, 1300 and something, all of a sudden, Middle Eastern traders wanted to come to Malaysia instead of neighboring countries because they knew that their religion was practiced. And so they could find food and they could find places to worship, and they knew that they'd be able to follow all of the expectations of life. Whereas if they go to Thailand, which is predominantly Buddhist, or to India, which is predominantly Hindu, so Malaysia became a very attractive place for traders. And they brought in all sorts of product, but beads was the one that really took off. Because you can see these traditional marriage garments that are made out of more traditional beads. So things made of stone or made of shell, made from traditional materials. But they also brought in beads from Venice and Europe, and the glass beads as well. And so the picture on the left is one that I took in the museum. When I tried to zoom in, it was less impressive. So the picture on the right is one I found online that shows similar styles of beads. But this one was the thing that I think was the most shocking to me of the entire museum, because that bead was worth the value of a human life. You could use that bead to buy a slave. And so the fact that a imported good had that much value, the one on the left was considered to just be priceless. Like, that would belong to the chief and that would be passed down from generation to generation, because there was nothing that could possibly be valuable enough to spend that on. But that they incorporated their own traditional handcraft goods with things that were brought in to the point that they were so valuable was just amazing to me. And so, I mean, as a whole, I guess, with Malaysia, I just loved the combination of that traditional indigenous lifestyle with, I mean, Kuala Lumpur with the Petronas Towers, with the tallest buildings in the world for a number of years, that you have that juxtaposition of modern lifestyle and amenities, and then also in the West, you also have the influence of China, because they had tin mines for many years, and little Indias, because India's close enough that you have a lot of immigrants bringing from all these different countries, and this blend of cultures and coexistence of religions that are very different, and yet at the same time, the practices are not so different that they can't get along. So I was just like really inspired by that and getting to witness that firsthand. So that is all I have. Which so are there any questions that I can answer in the 10-ish minutes that we have left?
I have one.
Yes.
Can you comment on safety?
So I felt very safe in Malaysia, that is. My friend and I, we were traveling alone, and we took trains to get almost everywhere, and we would leave our things at hostels. The law is pretty strictly enforced in Malaysia. Like, you would be publicly whipped for stealing. And so as a whole, there is not a lot of crime. If it is crime, it's normally crime of opportunity, but we never felt unsafe at all. The biggest safety issue would be if you choose to drive a car or a motorcycle, because roads are not necessarily very well maintained if you leave Kuala Lumpur. But in terms of Like we walked a lot of places to the point that my friend was getting really annoyed with me. She's like, it is literally $2 to get an Uber for a walk that would be 25 minutes. It is 90 degrees outside and sunny. Why are we walking? But we never felt like unsafe on the side of the road walking by ourselves either. Yeah. And we were also felt incredibly welcomed by the cultures as well. And I think that's part of Islam, and that one of the tenets is showing hospitality and feeding strangers. And so when we were in Malaysia, when we were in Brunei, like we got in a taxi, and at one point I realized that they didn't accept credit card and I didn't have cash, and it's like, oh, well, this is just a gift then, no worries, it's pay it forward. I can't imagine the United States you stiffing a taxi driver and not having it lead to something a lot more serious. But we were really blown away by how welcoming and kind, and everyone wanted to talk to us. And it's kind of neat that you oftentimes get the comment of, oh, I never realized that Americans were like this. Like, we just see things in the media, and so you're not that different from me, that we can have these conversations and we have so much in common. And I thought that was a really beautiful thing. I hope that answers your question about safety well enough, but.
Sounded like you felt safe.
Yes, I felt very safe.
Awesome, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
The food that was made in the bamboo,
Yes.
using different leaves,
Mhm.
and how did it taste?
It was really very good. It was a lot of very curry-like things, so it tasted pretty similar to other curries that I'd have. It was definitely a little, the ferns tasted a lot like spinach, I guess, if I had to. And then she was right that it did taste a lot like ginger, maybe a little more cilantro-y than I would have liked. It was a different type of plant, but it tasted a little bit like a coriander or cilantro root, but it was really very good. I happily eat it again. I don't think, unfortunately, that I'd be able to recreate a lot of that, because we're just picking random leaves and I'm showing the her being like, this is the right one, is it and also she's very picky, like, it has to be this color, because if it turns too dark, then it can be used for this instead, but it's not as good to eat. So yeah, it was all delicious. Got to try a lot of different takes on fried rice, or a lot of noodle dishes as well, with just whatever happens to be in season. Durian was in season when we were there. I don't know if you're familiar. That's the one that smells kind of like rotted flesh. So one of our hostels, in fact, was right on top of a stall that sold them, and so you could smell them everywhere. And I did not want to try them, but then when I was in Brunei, apparently the local comfort food is ambuyat, which I wish I would have now put a picture in. It's like this clear slime that kind of has the consistency of like boogers, with no taste whatsoever, but it is served with a fermented durian paste, because of course if the thing that smells like rotting flesh is fermented, that makes it so much better. And also with like whole fish and like a fermented shrimp fish paste as well, but then like a slow cooked beef and different vegetables. So it was an experience. I certainly wouldn't want to try durian again, but there are so many fruits in Malaysia that you don't find anywhere else in the world, like mangosteen and rambutan, I think, was one of them. And so it was neat to try things that, oh, this is in season, you can only get it now, we're not shipping in things when they're not fresh. But it was really neat to try some kind of one-of-a-kind foods.
Definitely.
Any other questions I can answer for you? All right. Well, thank you for coming out today. Hopefully you learned a little bit of something about some different cultures in Asia. I'm sorry for how much I rushed through. Like I said, I know it's a little bit of the speed version of 4 pretty major religions, but I do feel really lucky that I was able to have all of this experience in just the last year.
Thank you for
Thank you,
sharing.
that was awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't suppose anyone knows how to stop the live stream?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, wonderful,
So,
good.
Yep.
Great, because now I need to ask, why do you know what rotting